Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're cracking open Chapter 4, which is all about reinforcement and extinction. It's kind of like looking under the hood of human behavior, seeing what makes us tick.
Yeah, it really breaks down how our actions and the things that happen afterwards are connected. Like, it emphasizes that we aren't just automatically reacting to stuff around us, but that what we do is shaped by, well, the results of our actions.
So we're not just robots running on autopilot. It's more like our choices are influenced by what happens next.
Oh, exactly.
Speaking of choices, the chapter kicks off talking about operant behavior. And they use some pretty relatable examples, like a lion hunting for food. If the lion's successful, it's probably going to hunt again.
Exactly. And it's the same for us humans, too. Think about someone at a slot machine. Those random wins, even if they're not frequent, keep them pulling that lever.
Makes sense.
Or, like, students in a classroom. If they get praise for asking good questions, they're more likely to speak up again in the future. The chapter calls this emitted behavior. It's not guaranteed to happen every time, but the chances go up based on what happened before.
So it's less about automatic responses and more about, like, actions that become more likely if they've led to something good in the past.
Wow.
Which brings us to reinforcement. The chapter talks about these 4 basic types or contingencies of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and then positive and negative punishment. I feel like there's a lot of confusion out there about the difference between especially negative reinforcement and punishment, especially when we're working with clients.
Oh, absolutely. That's a super common mix-up. People often think they're the same, but they're totally different. Punishment, both the positive and negative types, are all about decreasing a behavior.
It's what we'd use if we wanted a behavior to stop, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But negative reinforcement, just like positive reinforcement, actually aims to increase a behavior. The difference is in how we make that behavior happen more.
Gotcha. So positive reinforcement is adding something good, and negative reinforcement is taking away something unpleasant, but both make that behavior go up. Do you have examples?
Sure. Let's say a kid's having tantrums at bedtime. If we use positive reinforcement, we might give them a sticker chart, right? And then a special treat if they go to bed without a fuss for a few nights. That's adding something good to increase the behavior of going to bed calmly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, let's say the same kid hates cleaning up their toys before bed. With negative reinforcement, we could say that if they go to bed calmly, they don't have to clean up their toys that night. We're taking away a chore they don't like to increase that good bedtime behavior.
Interesting.
Both ways can work, but it's about knowing which one fits better for the person and the situation.
That's really helpful to clear up. So it's not about whether something is good or bad, but more about what's added or taken away and how it affects the behavior we're focusing on. What about this idea that rewards actually kill motivation? I've heard that, like, using rewards can stifle someone's natural drive to do things just because they enjoy them. Does the chapter touch on that?
Yeah, that's where Cameron and her colleagues' research comes in. They did a meta-analysis, so basically a study of other studies, and their findings really busted that myth. They actually found that rewards connected to achievement can actually increase both intrinsic motivation and self-determination, especially when it's verbal rewards like praise and positive feedback.
Interesting.
When we acknowledge someone's effort and how they're improving, it can actually make them want to keep learning and growing.
That's good to know. As ABA professionals, we use reward systems all the time. So it's great to hear that we aren't accidentally hurting our clients' inner drive.
Yeah.
How do we put this research into practice, though?
Yeah.
How do we make sure those rewards are actually helping motivation and not just making someone dependent on getting those external rewards?
It's a balance for sure. We need to be strategic, tie rewards to meaningful achievements and gradually fade them out as the client gets more self-motivated. Let's say we're teaching a child to read. We might start with tangible rewards like a small toy or sticker for each page they read.
Okay.
Then as they get better, we can switch to verbal praise, and then eventually the focus shifts to the enjoyment and benefits of reading itself. It's about nurturing a feeling of mastery, so the client ends up finding the activity itself rewarding, not just chasing the external reward.
So it's not about relying on rewards forever, but using them like a stepping stone to help build that internal motivation.
Right.
Now, I'm intrigued by this thing called the Premack principle. It almost sounds like a magic trick using one behavior to reinforce another. How does that work exactly?
The Premack principle, sometimes called Grandma's Law, is all about using activities someone already likes to our advantage. It basically says that a high probability behavior, something someone enjoys and does a lot, can be used to reinforce a low probability behavior, something they might not be as keen on. Think of it like you can watch TV after you finish your homework.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah.
So instead of bringing in a whole new reward, we're using something they already like and making it depend on them finishing a less preferred task. But how do we know what activities are actually going to be reinforcing? And are there any ethical things to think about when using this?
You've hit on two really important points there. First, to use the Premack principle effectively, we really need to understand the individual's preferences, like what do they truly enjoy and find motivating. This might involve doing a preference assessment or just observing what they naturally gravitate towards in their everyday life. We've got to make sure that the chosen activity is actually something they find reinforcing, otherwise it won't work. And ethically, we always need to be considering the potential downsides of any intervention.
That makes sense.
Like if we're using screen time as a reinforcer, we need to be careful that it's not too much and that it's not getting in the way of other important stuff like sleep or social interaction.
Good point. So it's not just picking any old preferred activity. It's about being thoughtful and choosing something that's both motivating and aligns with the client's well-being overall. Speaking of building new behaviors, the chapter also talks about shaping. They use this cool analogy of molding clay into a specific shape. How does that apply into changing behavior?
Shaping is all about breaking a complex skill into smaller, easier steps. It's like a gradual process of reinforcing those steps as we get closer to the behavior we want to see. Imagine teaching a child to tie their shoes. You wouldn't expect them to get it all at once, would you?
No, definitely not. You'd start with simple things, like holding the laces correctly, making loops, and then finally tying the knot.
Exactly. And by reinforcing each of those small wins, we're shaping the behavior, getting closer and closer to that final goal. It's really useful for building new skills, especially when it's a complicated task.
The chapter connects shaping to something so natural, like how birds learn their songs.
Right.
It talks about how young birds slowly refine their melodies through feedback and reinforcement, eventually getting to the complex song of an adult bird. It's amazing how this idea applies across different species.
Yeah.
But how do we know which steps to reinforce? And how do we avoid getting stuck at a certain level?
Great questions. When we're shaping a behavior, we need to carefully break down that skill into logical steps and then figure out what level of performance we'll reinforce at each stage. It's like building a staircase. Each step gets us closer to the top. We start by reinforcing that first step, then move on to the next as the individual masters the one before it. We don't want to reinforce too early because that can make things stall, but we also don't want to reinforce too late because that can be discouraging.
Makes sense.
It's all about finding that sweet spot where the reinforcement is both motivating and challenging enough to keep things moving forward.
So it's about being a keen observer and adjusting our reinforcement based on how the person is progressing. Now let's switch gears and dive into the world of extinction. This is where things get a little more, well, tricky, right?
Extinction is basically what happens when we stop reinforcing a behavior that was previously reinforced. We're breaking that connection between the action and its consequence. It's like shutting off the water supply that was feeding the behavior.
So if a behavior isn't giving the desired outcome anymore, it will likely decrease over time. Sounds simple in theory, but I bet it's messier in practice.
You got it. The idea of extinction is simple, but the actual process can be pretty tough. And the chapter points out some important side effects we need to watch out for.
Like what?
Well, the chapter mentions something called an extinction burst. What is that exactly, and how does it show up in real life? An extinction burst is when the behavior actually increases temporarily after we first take away the reinforcement.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a vending machine that suddenly stops working. You might press the button over and over, try other buttons, or even kick the machine out of frustration.
Yeah, I've been there.
That's an extinction burst.
So it's like the behavior is making one last attempt to get that reinforcement before giving up. Makes sense, we're creatures of habit. It takes time to adapt when something stops working the way it used to. But how do we know if a behavior is actually decreasing or if it's just that extinction burst happening?
That's where careful observation and data come in. We need to track the frequency, how long it lasts, and how intense the behavior is over time. If we see a spike at the beginning followed by a gradual decrease, that's probably an extinction burst. But if it stays high or even keeps increasing over a longer period, then we need to rethink our approach.
So it's not just waiting around for the behavior to disappear on its own. It's about actively keeping track of what's happening to make sure we're on the right path. I imagine things can get pretty emotional during this process too, right? The chapter talks about things like frustration and aggression.
Absolutely. Extinction can be frustrating, not just for the person whose behavior we're trying to change, but for everyone involved.
Hmm.
Remember the vending machine. Sometimes people don't just kick it, they might try to tip it over. That's why it's super important for us as ABA professionals to be ready for these challenges. We need to prep our clients and those who support them for the possibility of that extinction burst and give them ways to cope with the frustration that might come up.
That makes sense. It sounds like an ethical responsibility we have to make sure extinction procedures are done in a safe and supportive way. So it's not just about reducing a behavior, but doing it in a way that minimizes distress and promotes well-being. Why is it that some behaviors just seem to hang on for dear life, even when they're not being reinforced anymore? The chapter talks about resistance to extinction. What makes certain behaviors so persistent?
A few things can make a behavior resist extinction. One biggie is the history of reinforcement. Behaviors that have been reinforced sometimes, but not every time, tend to be harder to extinguish than those that were always reinforced.
Like the gambler at the slot machine, right?
Exactly.
They're used to those occasional wins, so they keep pulling that lever, even when the wins happen less often or stop altogether.
Right. The fact that the reward isn't predictable actually strengthens the behavior. We need to keep that in mind when we're designing interventions. If a behavior has been reinforced on and off in the past, we need to be prepared for it to take longer to extinguish.
It's about setting realistic expectations and understanding that change doesn't always happen overnight. What about spontaneous recovery? I've heard that even when a behavior seems like it's gone, it can suddenly pop back up. How is that possible?
Spontaneous recovery happens when a behavior we thought was extinguished comes back after a period of no reinforcement. It's kind of like a memory being jogged. Imagine a phone you haven't used in years. If it suddenly rings, you might instinctively reach for it, even though you know it's not going to work.
So it's not that the behavior is totally forgotten. It's more like it's dormant, waiting for the right cue to come back. What kind of cues can cause this spontaneous recovery?
It's often triggered by things in the environment that were connected to the original reinforcement.
Hmm.
For example, someone who quit smoking might suddenly crave a cigarette when they're in a place where they used to smoke, like a bar with friends. Or a child who stopped having tantrums at bedtime might start up again if a new babysitter gives in to their demands.
So it's not just about extinguishing the behavior. It's also about dealing with the things around them that might make it come back. How can we help our clients stay on track and prevent those relapses?
That's where relapse prevention comes in. We can use techniques like cue exposure therapy, where we slowly expose the client to triggers in a safe environment so they can build coping skills. We can also teach them how to manage their own triggers and cravings.
It's about giving them the power to control their behavior and handle tough situations without falling back into old patterns. So even though extinction can be complex and nuanced, it's a powerful tool for changing behavior when it's done thoughtfully and ethically.
Exactly. Understanding how extinction and recovery work is essential for creating effective and lasting plans for behavior change.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to make sure we're clear on the difference between extinction and forgetting. We use these terms interchangeably sometimes, but the chapter is clear that they're different processes. Can you explain the distinction?
Extinction, like we've been talking about, is all about breaking the link between an action and what happens afterward. Forgetting, on the other hand, means that the memory of the behavior has faded over time. It's like the difference between deleting a file from your computer versus just losing track of where you saved it.
So with extinction, the behavior's still there, but it's not being reinforced, so it's less likely. But with forgetting, the behavior might not even be accessible anymore because the memory has weakened.
Precisely. The chapter uses a classic experiment by Skinner with rats.
Oh, yeah.
He found that rats who were stopped from pressing a lever for a long time still remembered how to do it when they got the chance, even though they were less resistant to extinction.
So it's not like the behavior was completely erased from their brains. It's more like it was put on the back burner and can be reactivated under the right circumstances.
That's a great way to put it. That's why understanding these subtle differences is so important for us in ABA.
It's about recognizing that behavior change is always in motion. Even when a behavior seems gone, we have to be aware of the things that might bring it back.
You got it. It's about being aware and proactive in our approach to make sure behavior change lasts.
Wow. We've covered so much in this first part of our deep dive into Chapter 4. We explored the basics of operant behavior, reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. And we've talked about some of the challenges and nuances that come with using these principles in real-world settings. But there's more to come.
Right. In the next part, we'll keep exploring how complex extinction can be. We'll look at real-life examples of how these ideas can be used to deal with tough behaviors. We'll also talk about some important ethical considerations to make sure extinction procedures are used responsibly and effectively. Let's jump into a real-life example of how extinction plays out. The chapter talks about a case study with a 20-month-old who was having those classic bedtime tantrums.
Bedtime tantrums. I think every parent knows those. What was going on in this case?
Well, the researchers saw that the parents were actually accidentally reinforcing the tantrums by giving the kid attention every time they cried. Like every time the child cried, one parent would go back into the room, which, ended up rewarding the behavior.
Right. It's natural for parents to want to soothe their kid when they're upset. But here it was actually fueling the tantrum. So how did they break that cycle?
They used an extinction procedure. Basically, the parents would leave the room at bedtime and not give in to the crying. Sounds tough, but the idea is to stop giving that reinforcement, that parental attention, which was keeping the tantrums going.
I can imagine that was hard for the parents. It goes against every instinct to ignore your child when they're crying. Did it work, though?
It did. The tantrums dropped way down once the parents started using the extinction procedure. By taking away that accidental reinforcement, they managed to extinguish the behavior.
That's great to hear. But I bet it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it?
Yeah.
The chapter mentions a little hiccup in this case, right?
Yep, there's a twist. The child's aunt came to visit and, well, she didn't know about the plan. So she ended up reinforcing the crying by staying in the room with the child. Guess what happened?
The tantrums came back.
Right back. So yeah, even one instance of reinforcement, even if it wasn't meant to be, can undo a lot of work. This really shows how important clear communication and teamwork are when working with a child's care.
It takes a village, right? Everyone needs to be on board and understand how extinction works to make sure things stay consistent. So what happened when the aunt left? Were the parents able to get back on track?
Luckily, yes. Once the aunt was gone, they went back to the extinction procedure, and eventually those bedtime tantrums were gone for good.
That's good news.
This case study has some really useful lessons for us ABA folks. It emphasizes how important it is to teach caregivers about reinforcement and extinction, making sure everyone understands and agrees on the plan.
We're not just working with the individual, we're working with their whole support system, right? Consistency and collaboration are key.
So we've talked a lot about how extinction works, but how do we know when it's the right approach? Are there times when extinction might be more or less suitable?
That's a key question. Extinction isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to consider a few things before deciding if it's the right way to go.
Like what?
First, we've got to understand why the person is doing the behavior. What purpose does it serve for them?
Okay.
Once we know that function, we can figure out if extinction is likely to work.
So if a behavior is happening because it gets attention, like those bedtime tantrums, extinction might be a good choice. But what if the behavior is about escaping something or getting something they want?
If it's about escape, like the person's doing the behavior to get out of something unpleasant, extinction might not be the best on its own.
Say a kid throws a tantrum to avoid homework. Just ignoring the tantrum might not fix the fact that they see the homework as a chore they want to escape. In these cases, we might need to combine extinction with other strategies, like teaching them different behaviors or making the task less unpleasant.
So we address the root of the problem, not just the behavior itself. Makes sense. What about behaviors that are about getting something tangible, like a toy or a treat?
Right. If a behavior is happening because it gets the person access to something they want, extinction might not be enough on its own. For instance, if a kid is screaming for a toy, ignoring the screaming might not stop the behavior if they end up getting the toy anyway. We might need to use differential reinforcement in these cases, meaning we reinforce those other better behaviors and don't reinforce the problem behavior.
So we're not ditching extinction, but using it wisely with other tools to address the underlying reason for the behavior.
Exactly. It's about tailoring our approach to each person and their specific situation. And of course, we need to think about whether using extinction is safe and practical.
Safety first, always. What are some safety issues we might run into with extinction?
Well, extinction can sometimes cause problem behaviors to increase, like we talked about with the extinction burst. This can be risky if the behavior is aggressive or harmful. We need to make sure we have safety measures in place to protect everyone involved. This might mean having extra staff, using protective gear, or teaching alternative, safer ways to communicate needs.
That's vital. We have to be proactive in thinking about and managing potential risks. What about the practicality of it? What things might make it hard or even impossible to do extinction effectively?
Extinction can be tough if we can't control what's reinforcing the behavior. For example, if a kid's doing something to get attention, but they're getting attention from their friends, it's going to be difficult to extinguish that behavior just by having parents withhold attention. We need to be able to control what's reinforcing the behavior to do extinction right.
It's like trying to put out a fire but only taking away some of the fuel.
Yeah.
We need to address all the sources of reinforcement to make a real difference.
That's a great analogy. We also need to be on the lookout for accidental reinforcement. Even a small slip-up can set us back. That's why it's so important to teach everyone involved about staying consistent and having a clear plan for handling those accidental reinforcements.
It's a team effort. Everyone needs to be on the same page to make sure extinction works. So extinction's a powerful tool, but it's not magic. It takes careful planning, consistent effort, and keeping a close eye on things to make sure it's effective and ethical.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding how it works, anticipating the hurdles, and adjusting our approach based on the person and the specific behavior we're working on.
This has been such an eye-opening exploration of extinction. We've looked at the principles, the potential good and the challenges, and some key considerations for ethical and effective implementation. But we're not quite finished with Chapter 4 yet. There's one more concept I'm super curious about: reinstatement.
Reinstatement is fascinating. It really shows how persistent learning can be, even after we've extinguished a behavior. It reminds us that behavior change isn't always a straight line, and we can hit bumps along the way.
Let's dig into that. What is reinstatement exactly, and how does it show up in real life?
Reinstatement is when a behavior we thought was gone pops back up after the person is exposed to what used to reinforce it.
So it's like the behavior gets a taste of that reward and comes back to life.
Exactly. It's like the brain remembers that reinforcement, and even a little bit of exposure can bring the behavior back. Imagine someone who quit smoking. They've successfully stopped, but then they go to a party where everyone's smoking. Suddenly they're craving a cigarette. That exposure, seeing and smelling cigarettes, triggered a reinstatement of the behavior.
That's a really powerful example. It shows how easy it can be to relapse, even when someone has made great progress. Are there other situations where we might see reinstatement happening?
Oh, definitely. Reinstatement is really common with substance use disorders. Someone who's been sober for years might suddenly relapse if they encounter something that triggers them, like a place, a person, even a certain smell they link to using drugs.
So it's not just about willpower. It's about understanding how these cues in our environment can take over and trigger those ingrained behavior patterns.
Right. And this highlights the importance of relapse prevention strategies. We need to help people identify their triggers and learn ways to cope so they can handle those situations without going back to the old behaviors.
It's about building resilience, giving people the tools to navigate those tough situations without falling back into old habits. But how does reinstatement work from a behavior analysis perspective? What's going on in the brain that makes this behavior come back?
From a behavioral standpoint, we think reinstatement is a type of conditioned response. In the beginning, when the person was learning, the behavior became linked to that reinforcer. When we take away the reinforcer during extinction, that link weakens, but it doesn't vanish entirely. Exposing them to the reinforcer again reactivates that link, making the behavior more likely to happen again.
So the brain's like, hey, I remember this. This used to lead to something good.
That's it. Even a little exposure can rekindle that connection. That's why we have to be so aware of those potential triggers and develop strategies to manage them. For people recovering from substance use, this could mean staying away from places where they used to use drugs or people they used to use with. It could also mean learning new ways to cope with cravings and urges.
So reinstatement shows us that behavior change is constantly evolving. Even when a behavior seems gone, we need to watch out for those triggers and have relapse prevention strategies in place.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that learning and behavior are complex and setbacks are normal. By knowing how reinforcement, extinction, and reinstatement work, we can create more effective and compassionate interventions to help people change their behavior for good.
This has been an incredible exploration of extinction and all its twists and turns. But before we move on, I'm curious, how does understanding all this help us be better ABA professionals in our everyday work? What are some key takeaways for us when we're working with clients?
That's a great question. One big takeaway is that careful planning and individualizing treatment plans is essential. Extinction isn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
We need to think about why the behavior is happening, what's been reinforcing it in the past, and the individual specific needs and situation when we're deciding if extinction is the right approach and how to use it best.
It's about being thoughtful and deliberate, not just jumping into a procedure without getting the whole picture.
Exactly. Another important thing is collaboration and communication. Extinction usually needs the support of everyone involved. Parents, caregivers, teachers, other professionals.
Right. The whole team.
We need to make sure everyone's on the same page, knows how extinction works, and is committed to being consistent.
Teamwork makes the dream work. Clear communication is essential for success.
Definitely. And finally, it's important to remember that extinction can be tough for both the person and those supporting them. We need to be patient, understanding, and supportive. We also need to be ready to adjust our approach if needed based on how the person responds. Changing behavior takes time and effort, and setbacks are just part of the journey.
It's about meeting people where they are and giving them the tools and support they need to make those meaningful and lasting changes.
Exactly. By understanding extinction and approaching it with empathy and a willingness to learn and adapt, we can help people reach their goals and live more fulfilling lives. It really has been a deep dive. Before we finish up, let's touch on a few more points about extinction that the chapter brings up. Sometimes it's not about wiping out a behavior completely, but more about just bringing it down, making it less frequent or intense.
Right, that makes sense. Not every behavior needs to be gone completely. Some just need to be dialed back a bit. How do we decide how much reduction is enough?
That's where good assessment comes in, and working closely with the person and everyone supporting them.
Yeah.
We need to think about how the behavior is affecting their life, their quality of life, their relationships, their ability to function in different places. Sometimes even a small change in how often or how intense a behavior is can make a huge difference.
It's about finding that balance between what's really meaningful clinically and what we can realistically achieve. But how do we know we've hit that point? How do we measure whether extinction is working?
Data, data, data.
Always.
We have to track the behavior to see if it's really going down because of the extinction procedure. And we need to be aware of other things that might be affecting the behavior too, like changes in medication, stress in the environment, even changes in the person's routine. It's important to rule those things out before saying that extinction is the only reason for the change.
So it's not just about seeing the behavior decrease, it's about understanding the whole picture and making sure we're giving credit to the right factors. Data helps us make smart decisions and tweak our approach if we need to. I'm curious, can we use extinction proactively, not just to fix existing problems, but to stop new behaviors from developing at all?
Interesting question. Extinction is usually used for behaviors that are already happening.
Right.
But the ideas behind it can definitely inform our preventative strategies. When we understand how reinforcement shapes behavior, we can be more aware of the consequences we're giving, whether we mean to or not.
So if we're careful not to accidentally reinforce those unwanted behaviors, we might be able to stop them from becoming a habit in the first place.
Exactly. Like, if we know a child tends to have tantrums when they don't get what they want, we can be proactive. Teach them other ways to communicate their needs and give them lots of positive reinforcement for good behavior. That can make tantrums less likely to become their go-to strategy.
It's like setting them up for success with positive behaviors right from the start. Sounds like knowing about reinforcement and extinction really helps us be more thoughtful and effective in how we approach behavior change, both proactively and when we're addressing existing behaviors.
Totally. It's a really powerful way to understand how human behavior works and to come up with interventions that are both effective and kind. By using data, working with individuals and their support systems, and always learning and growing, we can truly make a difference in people's lives.
This deep dive into Chapter 4 has been amazing. We've really broken down the core ideas of reinforcement, punishment, and extinction, explored all their little details and how they apply in real life, and we've gained some great insights into how to use these concepts to help people change their behavior for the better. We talked about individualized plans, working together, and using data and compassion in our approach.
And remember, behavior analysis is always moving forward. Stay curious, keep learning, and never stop exploring the fascinating world of behavior. Every time you interact with someone, it's a chance to make a positive impact.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fundamentals of behavior change. We hope you've learned a lot and gotten some practical tips to use in your own work as ABA professionals. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.